Perfect. So this is the Beyond Blackness event on Diversity Week. It's the second Diversity Week in UCD. And I'm the Diversity and Inclusion Officer for the SU, Paula, and I'm very excited to do this. I think the people that we have right now are incredible. I really look up to them. And we basically are trying to talk about Blackness and how people perceive it and how maybe it's not the sole identity of people that are categorized as Black, but because of the stereotypes is seen usually as that or is seen as the first thing. And so I want to discuss that. And so I was going to ask if each of you guys can introduce yourself a little bit, and mostly if you can describe the main work you are involved in now, like your main project. Thank you. You want to go, Brianna?
Well, I go first. I was like, I'll just go. So hi, everybody. I'm Brianna Fitzsimons. I am a secondary school teacher, and I also am working as the education coordinator for Black and Irish with Eric over here. So yeah, I'm really happy to be here and chat with you guys. My big focus as education coordinator for Black and Irish is, at the moment, we're actually working on anti-bias and anti-racism training for school staff and educators all across Ireland. So I've developed a training that I'm hoping to roll out to everybody. It's picking up a lot of speed right now, so I'm really excited about it. And that's kind of my main focus as a teacher. I notice racism happening as a student myself, for years. I actually was thinking about it today before I got the call. I did 8 years of third level of education before becoming a teacher. And I think I had 2 lecturers who were not white over those 8 years. And then as a kid, I think I could count on my hand how many students I had who were, how many teachers I had who were not white in America. So it's something that's really important to me, representation and all of this stuff, and anti-racism training. So that's just a little bit about me and where I'm coming from today. So Eric.
Hello. So yes, my name is Eric Ihige. I am also part of Black and Irish. I'm the politics coordinator of Black and Irish. I also have my own podcast. I have a YouTube channel. I'm studying corporate law at NUI Galway. I think my interest in racial issues started when I was quite young. I grew up in a staunch Pan-Africanist household, so my mom always sort of steeped me in racial issues and in Black history, generally speaking, in a USA context, but also in an African context also. And of course, at Black and Irish, what we aim to do is build a more inclusive, cohesive Ireland for everybody, but particularly the Black Irish community, and to celebrate the contributions of the Black Irish community and show to the nation that it is possible to be both Black and Irish simultaneously. So this topic of Blackness, particularly in an Irish context, is a very important one for me personally speaking, but also for the Black and Irish team generally. So yes, this is all I have to say. Okay, eeny, meeny, miny, Sandrine.
Hi everyone, my name is Sandrine the Hero, and I'm a third year PhD student, and I'm a filmmaker and a writer as well. Like, when it comes to different forms of activism, I really believe in like writing or different forms of expression as a form of activism. And in that, I'm a really firm believer that, like, if you're annoyed about something or anything like that, like writing or just having a discussion about it really helps. So I've done a documentary last year. We did it on 2 years ago. We did it on Silencing Black Voices. We were detailing the lived experiences of Black and mixed race people in Ireland. And then this year we're in the process of, I'll be directing a documentary over the summer on looking at the different shades of Irishness. But we're going to be looking at it from a local point of Carlow, where I grew up, and we're going to be doing multiple interviews. So like with my little brothers who were born in Carlow versus me and my sister who've kind of grown up there, and like the way they idolize it. But for me, like, I found it as a place where I had to like learn a lot about Blackness and identity. So I really want to see how the different generation are understanding the dual identity. And then I'm also the co-founder and co-editor-in-chief of Unapologetic, where it's a literary and cultural artistic space where we really value and cherish marginalized voices in being the focal points and the focal speakers of different discourses that face them in Ireland, because like a lot of the times where there's different issues, like people are always speaking about it, but like they're not the ones which are experiencing it. So we really believe in power of just having your own narrative. And Eric Mamobo contributed to the first issue, so it's amazing there. So next, give to you, Mamobo.
Thanks for that. Hi, everyone. My name is Mamobo Ogoro. I am a final year PhD student at the University of Limerick. I'm a social psychologist, and my research revolves around the media and social representations of diverse communities in Ireland. I am also the founder of Gur Media, which is an impact-focused digital media company that aims to unify communities by having young people use their voice. Our mission is to create a movement of unity and shared understanding through open discourse and digital content and digital media. So we create content that highlights social issues and open discourse and open conversation in order for us to build common ground, because as you well know, society is very well polarized and there's a lack of spaces where we can actually meet in the middle and see from each other's perspectives. So that's my whole mission and goal, to unify the world. Back to you, Paula.
Thank you so much, everyone. And I'm so happy that we're all together in a chat, at least. For my first question, would it be, everything will be mostly related to your work, to the main work that you guys are working on right now. But of course, if you want to bring up experiences on you, but yeah, it's basically true that. And it's like, have you guys in the work that you do have encountered the problem of people having issues seeing beyond stereotypes? So let's say we talk about writers of color or even students, like people do having a bias and not even realizing that they cannot go after that. Or when you talk with people doing conversation. So you want to start again, Brianna, if you don't mind?
Sure. Yeah, so I've, well, as a teacher, I have experienced, yeah, a lot of stereotypes. So I can even talk about my experience when I first moved to Ireland. So I moved here in 2017 with my Irish husband, and I actually have German citizenship. I have EU citizenship through my grandparents, who were Jewish German Jews who had to leave Germany as displaced people and went to America, and it's a whole long thing. And then my dad is also, my other grandparents, are Puerto Rican. So I've got this kind of mix of cultures in me, and then married an Irishman, moved to Ireland. So I've got this kind of like global kind of perspective, I guess, and always had growing up in New York. So when I moved here, I found it really difficult. There were a lot of stereotypes about Americans, which is a weird thing to say, and they're not all good. And then it was very difficult for me to actually get a teaching job. It was very difficult for me to have my teaching credentials approved by the Teaching Council of Ireland. And I have the privilege of having gone to schools in English and having gone to prestigious universities and all this wonderful privilege that I was granted, coming from the States and all that stuff. And yet it still was difficult for me to work my way into the teaching establishment here in this country. I was really lucky and fortunate to find my school that I've been with for the last 5 years, which is a really diverse school. But unfortunately, it's difficult as a teacher to watch other teachers make a lot of assumptions about students based on where they're from, how they speak, what they look like, and all that other stuff. So that's the kind of day-to-day stuff that I struggle with and try to combat. And that's why I developed the training, obviously, that I developed. There's a lot of misunderstanding and, like you said, Paula, bias, like just kind of across the board. And I think it's really important that we start to recognize the bias that we have. I think a lot of people don't even realize that they feel the way they do or that they think the way they do. And so then treat students a certain way, or make assumptions that they can or can't do things and that kind of stuff. So it's kind of like, I think assumptions are made about me on a regular basis as well. I've found it very difficult to progress in the ladder of promotions within the school system as well. On paper, I think I'm pretty qualified. I've been teaching for 12 years. I have a lot of, credentials. I'm a special education teacher. I do a lot of important work in my school, I feel like, and yet I can't seem to progress while I see my younger white colleagues progress ahead of me. And so it's been very difficult. And I can't help but think that there's a bit of bias at play there. That I'm not Irish, that I'm not white. It could be a bunch of different things. But I've never been interviewed by anyone who's not white. Most people are also male, just to throw that out there as well. Yeah. But yeah, so like in that way.
Of stereotypes after a while, like it's like migrant and American and woman and not white.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like, okay, I'm never going to be who you think should be running schools, if that makes sense. Like that's where the bias feels like I don't belong in a leadership position within schools, which I think is completely the opposite of, obviously I feel like I do belong there. But I think school leadership across the board is primarily male. It's also all white. I don't think there's any school leader in the country. Teachers are 99% white and middle class in this country as well. So yeah, there's a lot of bias at play, and I guess that's where my work is really focused on that at the moment, is kind of recognizing those bias, teaching people some empathy, teaching people to recognize your bias and then do something about it. So we can't help the thoughts that come into our heads, right? We've all been socialized to think the way that we think, but we can work against that. And we can acknowledge those thoughts and say, okay, what are we going to do about it now? And that's what I think we need to kind of start working on. And I know you guys are all doing work along those lines as well, basically acknowledging the voices and showing people that those biases are just that. Do you know what I mean? Like no one has an idea of what anybody else is going through until you actually talk to someone. So that's kind of, someone else will pick that up, I'm sure.
To chime in next, I think in terms of the work that I do, stereotyping that I face, okay, to take my YouTube channel first, I put out a video, one of my first videos, I think it was my second ever YouTube video, and it was on my vision for Ireland in 2024. I actually submitted it for a competition. I was in 5th year when I put out the video. And I emphasized mental health. I emphasized the housing crisis and access to education. These are like pressing political issues in Ireland. And anyone, I think, who glances at the news will see headlines related to them. But the comment section was filled with Irish people essentially saying that I need to go back to my country, that I shouldn't try and fix Ireland, that my voice is not important, that I should go back to try and fix Africa. Now I'm left with no option but to think that if I was not Black and I said these issues, I'd be a bright, inspiring, exciting, young Irish pupil who wants to better the nation. But because I did not fit the descriptive kind of characterization they were looking for, those who commented, it didn't fulfill what they thought was sufficient in regards to the message I was trying to promote. So, and there's other videos that I've made in regards to Ireland. There's one I made about the power of Ireland's evolving heritage. And I talked about how Ireland's forebears who fought for Irish independence fought for a day where Ireland could embrace the diversity and the progress that it's made up until this point. Figures like John Hume, who emphasized diversity, for example, I think he envisioned an Ireland where people from different cultural backgrounds could live together, people from different traditions. I made a video on this subject, and again, people commented saying, no, diversity is destructive. We don't need it here in Ireland. Go back to your own country, go back to Africa. So in terms of my work, this is something that I think I've come into contact with quite frequently. In regards to my experience, it's the educational setting. And this is why, within the context of the Black and Irish team, but also personally, I think the work that Brianna is doing is so incredibly important. Because when I was in school, I'll never forget a time when I was in secondary school, and my teacher was talking about how poor Africa was essentially. And as I said earlier, I came from a very staunch Pan-Africanist home. So my mother always tried to teach me about the greatness of Africa. Like she'd sit me down and when I was like 10 and put on, I don't know, a 40-minute Malcolm X panel discussion. And I'd be like, Mommy, I don't want to watch this. But she'd always make sure that I knew where I came from and how Africa is powerful and how I'd meet people who try to convince me otherwise. So I said to my teacher that Africa is not poor. I said it because of how I'd been taught, but also because I knew that if he promoted the idea that Africa was poor, a lot of my fellow Irish students who sometimes had the Trócaire box stereotyping of Black people, would it simply bolster and empower a lot of the stereotypes they already held. I was standing up for myself, but I also knew my fellow Black classmates were going to be subjected to abuse that was a corollary to the teaching that my teacher shared on that day. But he denied it in front of the class. He said if Africa was not so poor, we wouldn't be sending them so much aid or something along these lines. So in my experience, I've definitely interacted with stereotyping also and through my work. And I think it's all down to a malnourishment of understanding of the fact that, of Africa, generally speaking, people come into contact with Africa based upon the Trócaire box, based upon charity advertisements, based upon a musical video, based upon YouTube videos, and they don't spend the time to see what they share with African people and the beauty of the culture that African people and Black people across the world, people of color, have. They don't take the time to see this, and it's not encouraged per se. I also come from a working class environment. The town I grew up in, Longford, the area I came from was predominantly working class. So I met a lot of people who had met a Black person for the first time in me. And surprisingly, through experience and being in touch with them and talking to them, I saw them let go of the discriminatory beliefs. But it's within the educated class, I think sometimes, that Ireland can sometimes falter, because there's a pompousness and arrogance where people feel as if they can't be biased and that they don't hold particular stereotypes. So from my experience, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in this regard, but I think it comes through education of the type that Brianna is promoting, but also sparking experience and trying to allow people to acknowledge our common ground, like what Momobo spoke to earlier. So this is what I'd have to say on this point.
I'll jump in. Yeah, just in regards to stereotype, definitely my first experience of stereotype in Ireland is, when I moved to Ireland when I was 10. So I remember when I think I was going to 3rd or 4th class, and I'm from Rwanda. So obviously, like, everyone always just, the first moment I say this, like, the genocide is the first thing, and is trying to figure out my age and everything like that. But I remember when I first moved to Ireland, my primary school teacher was like, oh, this is Sandrine, and she's from Africa and she's from Rwanda. And like, she made the class watch Hotel Rwanda. So just think of all the stereotypes that the class had. And so that was something that I had from a really young age, where it kind of like implemented in me this need to kind of have this mentality of having to like work 10 times harder, improve like my English, everything like that. So I just don't fall into the stereotype of what Hotel Rwanda represented. And I think it's been the same, like, the older I've gotten, like even in UL, like in my degree doing English and history, I've always been the only Black person in my like during my undergrad, my MA, and even on my PhD. And so, like, as Eric was saying, like in regards to like the love for Africa, like my PhD is on African literature, but my whole PhD centers around like the African future. And it's one of those things where I really, really love, because I've found myself, like, I've really reconnected with my love for the different richness and culture and symbolism and spirituality, like this all associated with Africa, which had kind of been taken away from my identity in Ireland because of all the stereotype. And again, trying to prove that you're something. But when I was doing that, like, I was letting go of like my Rwandese heritage. And like Eric's mom, like, my mom and dad, like, they made sure that we knew what Rwanda was outside of the genocide. So like, then again, like, we just weren't kind of going around with this victim mentality, or like really feeling ashamed of saying that you are like Rwandese and Irish. And it's something that's taken me a really long time to understand and to really appreciate. But definitely my PhD has done that. But even I've seen, like, in regards to the stereotype and the biases, I definitely face them in academia, and because like I'm in literature, so like in Irish literature, it's predominantly white, and it's something that I'm constantly arguing against and fighting against. But with that, there comes like a lot of pressure. Like, so like with different book chapters I produce, I use a post-colonial lens to look at kind of the hypocrisy of racism in Ireland, because how colonialism is always used as kind of the excuse to why, like this strong sense of nationalism, to why you can't have dual identity, because it took so long for Irishness and whiteness to be kind of interconnected. So like with a lot of my work, I do that, but I found that even through my writing, there's this bias that all that I write about is racism, because like you just want to always complain or anything like that. But for me, I really tried to shake that up by using theory and critical race theory and post-colonial theory, like with thinkers like Frantz Fanon, like with Black Skin, White Mask. Like it's looked at something so irrelevant, and something that even on Twitter, like I've seen it like with the debates going on critical race theory and how that's not something that's important, but it really is. And it engages and asks students to really think about the different lived experiences, but from like a critical perspective. And that's something that, as you know, like in CSB, SPHE should be taught from a really young age, where students are really made to think critically and challenge like the discourse, because everything that in mainstream in education is still the default is always whiteness. So I do think like when you are coming into, like from my perspective as like in academia or like as a writer in a predominantly white field, you're just subjected to stereotypes and biases, which again, there's a lot of pushbacks where, as I say, like if I introduce myself and I'm like, oh, I'm doing a PhD, there's this sense of like, fair play, because it's that sense of, oh, I could never imagine a Black woman doing it, versus if my white colleagues introduce them, it's like, oh, amazing. And like, even if I talk about my topic, again, it's because you're Black, you're doing it, versus if my white friends talk about how they're doing feminism, like nothing is said to them about like, oh, you're a woman and that's why you're doing it. So again, even those stereotypes about like, how do you afford your PhD and how do you do this, it's subjected and the biases are there. But the one thing that I've found to challenge these biases is by creating more space for minority voices to kind of challenge these predominantly white spaces. So I found that, especially last year when we launched Unapologetic, like the amount of support we got, and there was pushback, yes, because again, the Irish literary scene, it's very white and no one wants to listen to foreigners talking about their issues in Ireland. But again, I think it was such a beautiful thing to open up an Irish literary magazine and just seeing different names that wasn't O'Shea or anything like that. Like that was my win for me, where I was like, I've accomplished something. Where again, I've seen it because I tutor like in English literature, and like the surprise of students seeing a Black tutor talking about Irish literature, like that's something beautiful. So like it is by acknowledging the biases and acknowledging the stereotypes and just taking the space, as opposed to like trying to constantly change them or prove yourself with them, because I found that very, very exhausting. So the moment I let go of those stereotypes and those biases and just try to find a way of creating nuanced spaces where you're like centralizing and celebrating the richness of how Ireland is diverse, like that has definitely really worked out. And it, as I said, it pisses people off, but it's like we all belong in Ireland. So like if you're not happy with something, like it really does encourage you to like just take up the space without apologizing, like hence the word, hence the magazine Unapologetic.
That was great, Sandrine. Can you hear me? Sorry, my internet says I'm unstable. Is that okay? Okay, perfect. I'm just taking everything everyone was saying, and I don't know how I can follow everyone else after the great words that she said, but I'm just thinking of what Paula's question was in terms of just like my background as a psychologist as well. And particularly in social psychology, we kind of study human behavior in groups. And a lot of the work that I do is in terms of like intergroup conflict and prejudice. And one thing that I say that really takes people aback, and I'm like, yeah, it's human nature, is this idea that it's human nature to discriminate and it's human nature to stereotype. So our brains are so complex that it's hard for us to see every single person as different, or every single person as like nuanced and things like that, because we have 50 other million things to be thinking about. So oftentimes what happens is, in order for our brains to get things quickly, understand something very quickly, understand something cohesively, we just tend to put it in a box. We tend to put a category over them, and that's that. And unfortunately, what happens to a lot of communities, marginalized communities and underrepresented communities, the label that is put on that group tends to be one that is very negative, tends to be one that is highly divisive, and tends to be one that just perpetuates negative attitudes towards said group. So a lot of those ideas tend to stem from historically was the social group or your social surroundings. But as things such as like newspaper, TV, magazines, all these things, they were developing social consciousness and social and discourse. It really, the media helps shape how we kind of see different groups. And that's even worse when you have dynamics of majority and minority members. So there's this thing in social psychology called outgroup homogenization, where it's this idea that when you're in your own group, and this is regardless of if you're an underrepresented group or an overrepresented group, is that differences. You can see everything that's going on because you kind of just get it. You're in that group. So me as a woman, I know everything about being a woman. This is great. I can see every woman is different, everything like that. But then when you see the group that's different to you, it's easier for your brain to just slap a label on it. If I'm disconnecting, let me know. It's easier for your brain to slap a label on it. And it's just easier for your brain to just say, okay, they're just like that. I know a lot of women that say all men are the same, they're all trash, all these kind of things. So we tend to do that when it comes to cultural and racial communities as well, because it's easier for us to just slap the label on it. And if those labels are perpetuated with what we see in the media, it gets even worse for those communities as well. So that kind of leaves us into, let's say, having those negative stereotypes, having those negative representations, and having those negative outlooks in these communities as well. And I believe a lot of us, due to that negative media representation of our respective cultural or ethnic backgrounds, have faced discriminatory situations. So one thing I really, in the work that I do, is challenging these media representations through highlighting different voices, and particularly in the audiovisual center, because I'm one of those people that, like, you have to see who's speaking, see the person, see their voice, see their characteristics, see their humanity behind it. So I really I'm in the space where, like, in order for us to really challenge stereotypes, in order for us to move forward as a community, and in order for us to unify, we need to have open discourse and speak to each other. I'm kind of one of those people, and Sandrine can attest to this, that if anybody has like a negative outlook or a negative, or something that may be even controversial or a stereotype or something like that, I'm the kind of person that wants to sit with them and ask them, okay, where did you get that from? what happened with that? Why do you think that way? And it's really important, and this goes for loads of different communities as well. It's really important for us to have those sort of interactions and those sort of engagement with each other, because if we have those interactions with each other, we can actually debunk the stereotypes, and we can actually, what others were saying was, like, create empathy with each other, and then we can see our humanity. I think people can't really see, especially in media, don't really see the humanity behind the labels that society places on them as well. So I think open discourse, open conversation, engaging beyond the stereotype box that we put them in, really helps us to move forward together, and really helps us to debunk and remove. Okay, we can't necessarily remove stereotypes because they're always going to be there, but adds more nuance to the representations that they're already here in Ireland. So yeah, that's all I'm going to add. I don't want to take up more time.
Thanks so much, Momo. That's great. I love hearing you talk, because it's like so like psychology, in like of social stuff, which I'm not at all like in touch with, as like just politics. But thank you, everyone. But yeah, for example, I'm doing my dissertation, my thesis for my master. I'm doing a master on racial issues, decolonization, and migration right now. And my whole thesis is that for me, I have, when I moved here, but even back home, like all the time has been stereotypes about like, it's just surprising too, because I actually come from a quite well-off economic background because of my dad's job. And so I've always been in international schools, and like I learned many languages, and I play the violin and all these like posh stuff. But people will never ever believe it because of how I look. And like people even need to be shown, or like are completely in shock that someone that looks like me could do those things, you know? And then even when I put the things that I'm Latina and stuff like that, it's like, whoa, when you're doing a master and in UCD, it's like, how are you accepted almost? And I'm like, no, I'm doing a favor to UCD, but that's my opinion. But I agree that I feel everything is with discussion, because I also want to enter into this, but maybe you guys disagree with me, which is completely fine. Although I don't think Sandrine disagrees with me because she has helped me shape this idea. But I feel like here in Ireland, there is a lot of stereotyping going and a lot of oversimplification, like tagging people, putting them in boxes. But for me, it has been very hard to understand how it can be to such a level, because in every country that I live, because of my dad's job, every national population understands that they're national people, locals that are Black or look Asian or are mixed race, you know? And like more in the capitals is like everyone, of course, knows. But here in Ireland and in Dublin, which is where I've been living for the past 4 years, it seems to always be a shock to the white Irish population. It seems to be like such a impossibility to have Blackness and Irishness together, which is what my whole thesis is about, like how this can happen in like 2022, you know? So, but I've been talking with a lot of people because I think I went through a process to be like, okay, people are not just mean, like they're doing things in their brains and you have to talk with them. So I want to understand. I don't just want to hate. So I've been like, but why you think this and nanani? And I don't know what you guys will say, because all of you guys, you know, you being Irish or like having Irish partner for so long and moving here for so long. And I feel like sometimes because of the colonialist time of here and like the binary that they had with Protestant and Catholics, then like everything became more like a binary. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce. But like I feel like the racial binary here is like very intense. Like it's like, oh no, there's white and Black. And like now with the Brazilian population in Ireland, which is quite big, and we're all mixed race back home, and we all different shades, and our afros texture are very different, but we enter the Black community or we look indigenous because there was so much miscegenation in South America. For Irish people, that's like, what? Like, I do not comprehend. Or you're white, Irish, or you're Black, that you just arrived here. And I'm like, no, there's loads of things. So I wanted to know what you guys think about like that concept that here the racial binary is like very intense. So everyone puts in boxes way more.
Yeah, actually over the summer last year, I wrote a book chapter about that. And with what you were saying, I pinned it down to how Ireland was colonized and how when during like the period, like the historical period of the famine, and how like Irish migrated to places like the US and the UK, like they were seen as racially inferior when they migrated, you know? So like in places like America and in the UK, like there were those signs like, you know, no Blacks, no dogs, no Irish. So like when the Irish identity was formed, like unfortunately did link itself up to whiteness, and that's something that has not been able to be removed. So like, as you say, like when I've gone abroad and like in Spain or the UK and I'm like, oh, I'm Black and Irish, like that's not even a question, because it's like, oh, cool. But like in Ireland, the amount of times I have to be like, yes, been here since I was 10. My little brother is born here. It's just because there's this such strong identity and such strong nationalism. And even with that, I've linked that up to like masculinity, because again, if you think of like the Gaelic Association, and which becomes a funny thing because like my little brothers play GAA. So again, it's they're already reconstructing that. So it's within that historical sense and like the whole fact that we do share a history of migration, it just becomes really hard for people to let that go, because they view it as, oh, Black people are new. They came in 2006 with Celtic Tiger, but like through my research, I traced it back, like the presence of Black people in Ireland, like in the 18th century. So like when someone says that, I'm like, that's bullshit, like let's say. And even earlier before 2006, like my dad has been in Ireland for like over 20 years. So, you know, he came in 2000. And again, people don't want to accept that because there's still this sense of when you see someone who's Black or you see someone who's from a different ethnic minority that isn't white, it's, oh, you're in this host country. So Ireland is still a host country. So it doesn't matter how long you're here or anything like that. And I found myself that like when I do talk about being Rwandese and Irish, it's, I only get accepted in Ireland if I'm like, oh yeah, I've been here for like since I was 10. It's like, ah, sure, you're one of us. So again, it's the timeline because you've escaped that host country element of it. But it's something that even like when I write like, oh, where are you actually from? It's like, it's only Ireland that I get asked that. I've never been asked that anywhere else. Like, as you say, like because I tutor British literature and, you know, there's like Black British poets and like they talk about like that acceptance of being Jamaican and this, and they're so proud of it. But like here in Ireland, there's such a pushback because again, you have to prove you have an Irish passport. You have to prove you've been in Ireland for this long and your county and everything like that. So there's that really pushback, but it's still because people have not come into terms with Irishness and it's linked to whiteness. And I think it's only then like when we do admit like those two are exchangeable and you can't have one without the other, and trying to understand how it's such a dangerous and narrow-minded view to only view Irishness to whiteness because you're living out like a strong majority. And even for like younger generations, like my little brothers, which are born in Ireland, like, so if they are like playing GA and they're told to go back to Africa, like they wouldn't have a notion of where that's from. Like for them, it's like, oh yeah, my sisters are from Africa, I'm from Kilkenny, you know, so that's their understanding of it. And it does become really harmful when you're constantly asked to prove your Irishness, because as you say, like it's 2022 and we should just admit and like just move past that people do have dual Irish identity, and Irishness is no longer something that it's fixed or rigid, that it is interchangeable and it's always going to be changing. And I think the only reason that that's being stopped is because people still refuse to understand how Irishness is really linked to whiteness, and like it's always going to be seen as the default. And it's only until, again, like you, like it doesn't matter if you like marry into Irishness, anything like that, like people still view that. And again, as I said, it only in Ireland is it that I've been questioned on my Irishness. Everyone else is like, oh yeah, you have a weird accent, we'll accept that. But in Ireland, it's you have to prove why you're Black and Irish.
Yeah. Go on, Paula.
Yeah, I agree. Oh, sorry, guys. Mama, you wanted to talk, or Eric?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, and probably not contradict, but just counter some of the things that Sandrine said for the place, so you can bring me down to earth if I just go all over the place. But I was thinking, when it comes to this idea of, let's say, threat, there's two things a lot of people have when there's a perceived threat. And particularly when it comes to migration and migrant communities, there is this threat of economic loss, which is this idea that when migrants come into country, they're going to take our jobs, they're going to lose our money, That has been totally debunked, because when you have more people in the country, you need more jobs to have everything going. So people have been debunked with that. And then there's this idea of cultural threat. So when more people come into the country, we're going to lose our cultural identity. It's going to be washed, blah, 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 blah. And I think in Ireland, like Sandrine was saying, because there's this idea that whiteness is linked to Irishness, so cultural and national threat as well, it has made a lot of nationals, or not, I'm not going to say nationals, but made a lot of people want to protect that idea of Irishness, this idea of their nationhood as well. And because of that, that's why, and because of colonialization and the fight for the Irish to be white, deemed as like the British when they were colonized and everything like that, there's this sort of like wanting to hold on to the superiority that comes with being linked to whiteness, that it's hard for people to understand that one can be culturally diverse and Irish at the same time. And I think there's a lack of understanding of, well, the difference between nationality, race, and ethnicity as well. So there's a huge lack of understanding when people want to put all these Black and Irish things together and things like that, because people don't think that, they think like Black is always equal to African, if you know what I mean. But Blackness is a race, and that's socially constructed. And Irishness is a nationality, and that too is socially constructed as well. But it's important to have that as well, understanding as well. And I want to say as well, when it comes to the presence of people of African descent in Ireland, I would counter Sandrine's argument to say that while there were people in 1800s and things like that, it was literally like, you can count it on your hands, if you get what I mean. But when we had a prominent population, and mind the fact, to mind you, like, we're only 1.5% of the population out of 5 million people. So when there was a quote unquote prominent change in the demographics of Ireland, that only happened like in the mid 90s. Yes, there were people that are mixed race background in the mid 1900s, but when we had this sort of shift in migration, it only happened in the mid 90s. And I want to let people be aware of the fact that, like, Ireland is still very new to this whole thing, and we're seeing this sort of shift in consciousness as well when it comes to understanding social identity, cultural identity, dual cultural identity. And people always want to compare us to like the UK or France or America. Those countries have had like hundreds of years and they're still fucking it up, hundreds of years to figure out what it means to be culturally diverse as well. So we're literally like 30, 40 years into it, and people may think that's a long time, but it's important to actually just understand that these kind of changes in the political identity or the social identity of a demographic comes with time, and it comes with these active conversations as well. So when it comes to newer generations too as well, I think it goes back to education, in going back to the teaching system, and it goes back to how we let older generations know that, yes, people of migrant backgrounds are calling Ireland home, and their children are calling themselves Irish. Yes, they may have a different ethnic heritage, but that is aside to their national identity. Again, ethnicity and nationality and race are all different things. So it's important to really, and a lot of people are not aware that they're different things, particularly race and ethnicity. So it's important for us to educate wider communities that these things can coexist and do formulate and do change and do evolve over time. And a lot of the older generations, I remember interviewing people and talking to people, and just because I'm one of those people that just talk to anybody. I'm not very like upwardly argumentative with these kind of stuff. So I like to ask questions, but I'll be talking to people and they'll be like, but I remember a time where Ireland, like, you were just see a Black person, and now, yes, because you need to because we're going through this time of like social consciousness and social change, and it's important to ask those questions when it's a space that is safe as well. So it's important for me anyway, it's important to have a bit, not empathy, but unadjust your mindset. Once you have a belief for so many years, it's super hard to really kind of switch it off and change it. So I'm one of, again, back to education, having conversations, open dialogue, open discourse with people. And if at the end of the day, they debate with you, well, it is what it is. You go on with your life, I'll go on with mine. So yeah, I went on a tangent.
That was brilliant, Momo.
I'd love to comment on what you said, Paula, actually directly to what you said about the strictness, the apparent strictness of the racial perception here in Ireland. And I definitely agree to a great extent with a lot of what has already been said. But I think one thing that can't be overlooked is what you said, Sandrine, about the national attitude in Ireland. There's a very patriotic spirit in Ireland that prevails. And you drew on the conflict between nationalists and unionists, and we saw it manifest itself. We saw national tribalism and traditional tribalism manifest itself in the case of that conflict in a very extreme manner. There's a lot of pride in regards to being Irish that prevails here in Ireland. Figures like James Connolly, Pádraig Pearse, and the people who were involved in the 1916 Rising are hailed. And if you look at their writings, they wrote profoundly about what it meant to be Irish and about Irishness generally speaking. And I do think this patriotism, it's definitely a part of the zeitgeist, the cultural zeitgeist within the country. Now, once you mix that with the points Momobo were raising about our cognitive faculties and how they can sometimes sway us into thinking into biased ways, it adds another layer to the type of bias that might be present in other countries. Considering politics, what tends to happen is, if you look at a lot of populist parties, particularly regressive, extreme right-wing parties in Ireland, what they tend to do, as Momobo actually alluded to, is they allocate a lot of the issues within a society towards the newcomers, those who enter the society. If you look at the creation of race in the case of the United States of America, the thing that allowed the slaveholders to enslave Black people was the idea that Black people were subhuman. This was the pretext. It was impossible to espouse the Enlightenment-based values that said things like all men are created equal, and yet still discriminate against Black people within the country, unless Black people were not considered to be men and women, not considered to be human beings. We see this manifest itself in Europe today, across the world, even in Nigeria today. In South Africa, there was a case a few years ago of Nigerians being discriminated against, immigrants going there. So in Ireland, what tends to happen is, I think there's a mixture of that extreme patriotism and the kind of political scapegoating that we tend to see in the political realm all too often. And I think this can produce a lot of negative outcomes in regards to producing a racial binary that others, those who falls into one category, and normalizes another category. I think the popular perception also of Irishness is white homogeneity. It's white, it's speaking a certain way, depending on where you come from, you're into particular things. I think when we think of someone who's Irish, we don't necessarily think of someone who could come from any place on the racial spectrum, could come from any other place in the world other than Irish. Actually, there was a study done by the Pew Poll, the Pew Research Center, and it found that 64% of people in Ireland felt as if one had to have Irish ancestry to be considered Irish. If they didn't have that, they couldn't be officially considered Irish. So I think it speaks to that patriotism and to that pure blood sort of toxic type of nationalistic way of thinking that links Irishness to that homogeneous standard. So this is something that I've observed, Paula. Lastly, I think what Momobo said is very, very important in regards to the fact that the kind of mass emigration that occurred, that saw a lot of people from Africa coming to, and various parts of the world, particularly from Africa, Asia, coming to Ireland, began in the late 20th century. I went to see one of my friends. I went to one of my friend's house when I was in 6th year of secondary school, and I met her grandmother, who was a quite elderly lady at the time. And I talked to her, and she was very kind and she was very nice. This is one of the first people she's ever met of African descent, and she lived in Ireland nearly all her life. And she said to me, "You have really good English." Now, if I had met a teacher who said this, who, let's say, had experience traveling the world and who met Black people that come from various parts of the world, who might be more articulate than I am, this would be a surprising statement to make. And I think in line with the modern cultural lexicon, this would be classified as something of a microaggression, but it came from her. And she was so kind to me and she was so nice to me. And I know she said this because I was genuinely one of the few Black people that she's ever met. So when I see this, I see someone who's a relic of the old Ireland. I see myself as a representative, and all of you, of the new Ireland. And I think as Ireland modernizes and moves forward, it's the responsibility of many people like yourselves who are at the forefront of starting these conversations to help to push the idea of an Irish person not falling into a homogeneous standard. Our expectations for generations of old can be placed upon a particular pedestal, but we have to, I think, raise those expectations to ensure that in Ireland, it can encompass as many people as possible. And we also have to acknowledge the cultural times we're living in. Conversations like these, I don't think were occurring when I was younger. I couldn't imagine a teacher in my secondary school being interested in the type of anti-bias, anti-racism training that Brianna is working on. People genuinely care now and genuinely are interested. And I think it's a phenomenon across Europe. As we talked about earlier, I filmed a video on King Leopold II. I was asking people in Belgium what they thought about him. I think the only reason people care now about Leopold and the atrocities he committed is because voices like yours are at the table of discourse. This was not always the case. There was one dominant, hegemonic, European, homogeneous voice that prevailed. And it's shifting in a European context. And now it's shifting in an Irish context. So we have to ensure that takes form in a way that we can be proud of. So this is what I have to say to your point, Paula.
Thanks so much, Eric. I just wanted to say on your point before I forget, because I always forget about everything, is that, for example, here in Ireland, it has been one of the first times that my friends, of course, are liberal, they're middle class, all of these, they're super liberal, but I have to be the one to be all the time. And I've lived in 9 countries. It has been one of the only ones that I have to be like, they're like, oh, I want to reconnect with my Irishness because, the British, and there's this thing. It doesn't matter how liberal you are, you're very nationalistic, here, which to me is very shocking because in all other countries I've lived, liberal people are like, borders shouldn't exist, and like, what is a country almost, which I like. But they're very like, oh my God, I need to be more Irish. I need to learn how to play the fiddle and I need how to go, to a Gaeltacht and like, I need to, again, go to like learn like the dancing, like the Irish dancing. And I'm like, I think that is great. I think that is really, really nice. And I actually love that and that exists because I adore culture. But I thinking how you're thinking, that's a bit weird because I think anything can be Irish. That's not the sole way to be Irish. Like if I have a kid now and they're gonna be Irish and they just like reggaeton, Brazilian food, they look like me and they never want to play violin, they're gonna be completely Irish, And like that's news for them. Like it's kind of like taken aback. So for me, I agree. And it's nice to hear my mom's point too about like, you do need to give them time because it is true that in Ireland, the colonialism happened quite recently, even compared to us, Like it's crazy to see the dates and stuff, even compared to South American colonialism from the Spanish. But at the same time, I think it's so nice to see that, as we are saying, like we are just like, we have really high expectations of what the country should become, ASAP. You want to respond to the question, Brianna?
Sure, I've been listening to everybody's amazing points. And I have a different perspective just coming out of, I know people have mentioned the US and stuff like that. So I've lived that and then experienced what it's like here. So I guess I know a really common question I get asked as well is also, where are you really from? I get that all the time if I'm meeting a stranger. Oh, where are you from? Because I don't know if they hear my accent and they go, okay, where are you from? So I say I'm from New York. And then there's always like, where are you really from? And that's even as an American, which I think most people expect Americas to be diverse, but still there's this conception of things. And I don't know, obviously, I think we're all well aware of the nationalistic movement that's been going on in the States for the last way too long, too many years. Part of the reason why we left America was because of what was going on when Trump was coming into his presidency and all that horrible stuff. So I saw and felt things change. I saw and felt things change with my students. It was affecting teenagers. It was affecting lots of things. And I see mirrors of that here. I guess that's where I think what you guys are talking about with the nationalism, I think it can be wonderful. Like Paula just said, I think it's wonderful as well. I have my daughters are starting GAA, and I think it's great. Like I'm like, oh, this is great. I didn't have this growing up. Like we didn't have this sense of community and this identity, things like that. I come from such a multicultural household. I was constantly asked, in America, it's not where are you from? It's what are you? So it was always, what are you? What are you? What are you? Because there's no such thing as like an American, like, you know what I mean? In an ethnic sense. So it's constantly, as kids, we were taught to ask each other what we are. And so we put ourselves into groups based on what we thought we were. So I, having a mixed heritage, never knew what to say first because no matter what I said, I would be put into a group and I didn't fit into any of those groups. So it was very difficult. If I said my mom was German, then I got called a Nazi, even though I was the descendant of Jewish Germans. And they were mostly eradicated. I have Holocaust survivors from my grandparents. If I said I was Puerto Rican, then I was put in with Puerto Ricans and then they said, well, you don't speak Spanish. So I didn't grow up speaking Spanish. I didn't grow up speaking German either. I have English, and that's it. But I didn't fit in with the Puerto Ricans. I didn't fit in with the Latinas. I didn't fit in with the white kids. I didn't really fit in anywhere. So having that constant question of identity, I can definitely relate to you guys on so many levels for that. And I think when we're constantly questioning what people are, and asking, I know Momobo, you said earlier about putting people in boxes and putting it, like, it's such a human condition to absolutely do. And I think that's where there's so much danger in that. We lose so much of the sense of belonging. I think that's something I struggled with and I still struggle with. I'm 38 years old and I'm still trying to figure out where I belong. It's a crazy concept to not just feel like you are something and you belong where you are. So while I love Ireland because it has been welcoming to me in a lot of regards, I still don't feel like, I don't know if I'll ever feel Irish. I don't know if I'll ever say that I'm Irish. I don't know. My kids, one was born in the States, one was born here. My husband's obviously from here and we are here, but I still very much feel like I'm an outsider and I always will be. I'm asked a lot of questions about America. Like I get a lot of, so what do Americans think about this and stuff like that? And I'm like, I don't know. There's 350 million people over there. I'm just one person. And I left. I didn't want to stay there. So, can we talk about something else? Do you want to ask me who I am or what I like? What's my favorite color? Like that kind of stuff. So I think it's really hard. I think the nationalism is so nice and it's so comforting for Irish people. I think everybody's touched on the history and why that's there. But it makes me nervous with the nationalism that comes from the States. There's so many more layers to everything in the States and in the UK and in France and in Spain and everywhere else and in Latin America. And it's, the layers don't exist here in the same way. So I'm hopeful. I'm actually really hopeful. I think what Momobo said about things being so new, I think there's so many opportunities to learn and to be better. And that's what I'm really hopeful for. And that's why I'm like, I actually think that the training that I have, I don't know if I've talked about it, but like, I actually think it could actually work. I'm like, I actually have this energy about it. I actually think people will take it in and learn and listen. I do find that with the Irish people that they do want to be better. They do want to know more. They are genuinely inquisitive sometimes and want to know and just experience. They often go off and how many Irish people go and travel and spend time abroad and pre-COVID times and things like that. So I think there is this general sense of this global sense, the immigrant sense and everything like that. So I do feel like there is hope. And without the horribleness and the divisiveness of the States, it does that. I don't feel like it's that bad. Like I've felt worse, if that makes sense. I don't know if that helps, if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but that's kind of where I've been. That's how I kind of feel about all that.
Oh my God, that's amazing. Because exactly like my whole, like, I don't think I ever wanted to do racial activism and anti-racism activism in my life. I never thought I was gonna just be like so focused on it and my thesis and everything. Because I like, for example, yeah, like what I really like is plants and like growing vegetables. So it's very apart from that. And fiction. But when but I think that when I came here, I was so like, oh, I'm gonna become Irish because I decided this, because I lived in many countries for 3 years and so, and I totally felt like assimilated to Panama and like Panamanian almost, and same even in Spain, you know, because I was in a big city when I lived there. No one ever looked at me twice. Everyone was like, oh, you must be Spanish Latino, and I was like, I'll take that. I don't mind. When I was a kid. But then here, it was so intense. I feel like I even feel like a little exotic animal, you know, like how in every single room, people are to me like, no, no, ni, no, ni, like, where are you? Ni, all these, no, no. And even to me, growing up, because I was always friends with like other people from Black communities in other countries and stuff. And in many of our countries, you know, we have very different shades of people. I will never say, wow, I'm Black, you know, because I'm pretty light skinned. My Afro texture is pretty like loose, you know. I, of course, know that we have like Afro descendants, and I really, really like it. I think Afro Latino culture is incredible. But the fact that here, like everyone that is not completely Caucasian looking is like Black, you know? And then you're like, whoa, like, who are you in this room? And that's why I enter into this. And it's because I think now I have left the thought that I will ever feel Irish as a migrant, because there's also that layer of I'm genuinely a migrant, like I'm Latino. And I don't think this country in my age will make me feel like I'm part of it. But what I'm fighting for, I guess, is that people that are genuinely Irish, they're just a different color or whatever, they feel completely Irish and no one questions that, you know? Because my partner is Irish. And if we ever want to have kids, is that thought too? It's like, why would anyone question, you know, if they're Irish or not? So yeah, I have one last question, guys, and we're over. I'm so sorry. Have you guys found something that has worked in your project to bring down those initial stereotypes and get people seeing more the individual side of things?
Yeah, I could chime in there. I also want to acknowledge, Paula, that like if you look at the UK, I think there's such like what you said about you being seen as an exotic human being. I think it speaks to how Irish perception sometimes can see people seeing others as a novelty. Everything is a novelty. Like I came from a very small town, and anytime like we heard there was I remember one time there was talk that there was someone who's from America in the town, and we were playing football, me and my friends. We were quite young, and everyone was scurrying around like, America, America, to your boyfriend. Because we'd only saw it on television, American people on television. Ireland is like an island nation too. Furthermore, if you look at a place like the United Kingdom, the UK was a colonial empire once upon a time. So the places that the UK colonized, after colonization, they actually, after post-World War II, they looked to their colonies to take in people for work and jobs, and many people who arrived were discriminated against. And in England, there was a lot of controversy and crisis in and around that. But there was a connection per se, whereas in Ireland, the history isn't exactly the same. So nationalism is along the lines of homogeneity and a restrictive perception of Irishness that can see everyone else as a novelty, and therefore not allow them to be embraced by the idea, by the definition of Irishness. But to your question specifically, and I'll be as brief as I possibly can be, what in my work has worked? I think in a political context, something that I try to do is to allow people to recognize how politicians or regressive politicians, like a lot of the parties in Ireland that are quite racist, like the National Party, for example, the tactic they revert to is the tactic I spoke to earlier, the idea of politically scapegoating the migrant, allocating all the blame for all the problems within the nation on the migrant. People who, I've seen it with my eyes, come from working class communities, are sometimes disenfranchised, disillusioned. After the 2008 crash in Ireland, the Great Recession, a lot of people were harmed by government policy at the time. And during those periods of times when there's a lot of despondence and dissatisfaction and communal depression, people are looking for an outlet. there's a lot of anger. What tends to happen, what happened in throughout the 20th century with a lot of crazy dictators was that they allocated the blame upon a group, and to the depressed, despondent citizen, any excuse is sufficient, particularly for charismatic party that is patriotic, quote unquote, and nationalistic, speaks to this idea. So with politics, I try my best in my work to allow people to see how cyclical this is. It's occurred again and again and again throughout history. So I think allowing citizens to see through this means that if a politician arises to try and scapegoat or other an immigrant, or allocate the blame for political issues upon migrants who are trying to find their Irishness within the broader Irish national context, people can see right through that and understand that it's a political tactic that has been used time and again, and to try and put it out of date so people can think with sophistication about what's occurring, because it's very popular and it works across the world. And I think it really nicely ties into what Mobo was saying about our tendency to think in in-group, out-group ways. It's occurred in Nigeria. It's partly what spurred the Nigerian Civil War. So I think here in Ireland, getting to the bottom of that is incredibly important. Apart from that, in regards to YouTube and podcasting and stuff like that, I just try and talk with as many people as I possibly can to simply get their insights into things and to connect with people from my town too, Longford. Again, I grew up in a predominantly working class environment. And one thing that allowed me to see was a lot of the worst of the kind of experiences, my worst experiences with discrimination was within that environment. A lot of my best experiences were in that environment too, because there was less of an arrogance that you can see amongst people who are sometimes educated, who claim that racism is not a possibility for them. There was more of an appreciation for one's deficiency. So it's a complex phenomenon, I think, that particular areas within Irish society have to offer in terms of teaching us about our potential. So I try to connect with people to share stories about how best we can approach the racial issue in Ireland. So yes, this is the approach, generally speaking. So helping us recognize our common humanity, but calling out the political tactics so that we fall for it less in Ireland.
Yeah, I just want to touch base with what Eric was saying as well, in terms of just like, I just put in the chat there, I was like, political psychology 101. In order to mobilize people, you need to create a common enemy. It's very easy, and it's very easily done online as well. And that's how actually a lot of social movements gain a lot of popularity online, is by getting people to be angry at someone. It's the easiest way. And I was actually talking about this to my supervisor, because she's a political psychologist. And we were talking about how to mobilize. It's always easy to like get people get angry and getting going when there's like a common enemy. And this can be both sides of political spectrum. So in the right, it'll probably be like the migrants. In the left, it'll probably be like, I don't know, rich billionaires or something like that. But it's this idea that once we have a common enemy, it's easier for us to keep going. But then you rarely hear the stories of, and it's not really as sexy when there's things that highlight our common humanity, as Eric was angry and fighting with each other and just engaging in open discourse and open conversation. It's not as sexy in the media. It's not as like controversial or clickbaity. So it's very hard to mobilize people in order for us to find things that bring us together rather than divide us. And that's something I'm really, just myself included, with what I'm doing with Gore Media, is trying to hone into the things that unite us as human beings. Because at the end of the day, we're all just human beings trying to do this thing called life, and highlights with that common humanity that we all have. Certain people have certain difficulties that come along with that. And it's important to understand those difficulties and understand the privileges that each and every one of us have as well. So again, like what Eric was saying, is just creating spaces in which we can have like open conversation and really seeing the humanity in each one of us. And once we see the humanity, we can actually move forward in a sort of unified front, divide working class people. So basically the rich people that were up top, they were like, oh, let's create this thing called race. So the working class people couldn't, because there was less rich people than the working class people. So they basically just gave I don't know, swords to the working class white people and said, "You're better than the black people. They're not human. You are better than them." So that's it. So it goes back to how like race was invented. So in order for us to kind of like do away with a lot of the discrimination that goes about, it's understanding the histories that we do have, talking about those histories, but moving forward in a united front and together, like as one, if you get what I mean. So that's a lot of the work that I'm doing and how we kind of do it through digital media and digital content.
I'd like to briefly say, just to Momobo's point, 2 sentences. Why it's so hard too is because I'm sure you know this, Momobo. It literally speaks against Twitter is so popular because it allows the worst of our human impulses to just manifest themselves. You could just be everything your mom told you not to be to your friends in primary school. Just let it all out, because we're naturally inclined as Homo sapiens to act in particular ways. It's hardwired, and defeating that inclination is to try and sit down and try and appreciate a common humanity. And I think here in Ireland, encouraging, like through Brianna's anti-racism framework, encouraging people to see the fact that people who might not look or align in the context of their appearance with that homogeneous benchmark of Irishness that you set out, they too are human beings and they experience particular things because of racism and bias and discrimination. I think this is incredibly important, and I think through conversation that can be achieved. Lastly, an anecdote: when I was in secondary school, there was one really nationalist friend of mine, and he talked to me once. I was talking to him about black slavery, the North Atlantic slave trade. And he told me, well, the Irish were slaves, and the Irish were slaves for longer. We were very young. I said, you can't say that. I said, black people were slaves. And I didn't know about indentured servitude at the time, but that really deflated my bubble. He thought he had one over me because you were slaves for longer. Well, imagine if we both sat down and talked about the experiences of the Irish, the experiences of the black people in America and in Africa, and the commonality, because the link is so similar in regards to how it occurred, and those who spearheaded the indentured servitude and the slave trade. And there's a lot of it is based in America. Then we could talk about Frederick Douglass and Daniel O'Connell and the relationship they had. Then we could build a bond and go forward. But once you're young, the worst of your human impulses are more likely to manifest. And I think within the political space today, those dichotomous, simplistic ways of thinking prevail. And that's why I drew on the working class community that I come from, because in that community, you might find people who are former convicts, people who once did something that they really regret, or people who have a particular aspect of their life that they're shy of. But when they speak to you, they say, you can be better than this. And when you speak to them, you can see them as more than that thing that they did, more than that mistake that they made. I'm so confused that amongst the educated class, this is just not a popular way of thinking. So yes, it was more than 2 sentences. I'm sorry.
Can I just jump in there, and I'll be super quick, I promise. So just what you both have said about building empathy, I think that's the core. Like when I was doing all my research and bringing the training together, it was all about empathy and belonging and all that stuff in humanity. And I think it's really important to focus on who we are. And I really like to have people start with conversations about who each of us are, what we like, what we don't like, and just coming together on common ground about other stuff, like easy stuff. And then you can get into the hard stuff. So I think that's where I hope my work is I'm hoping it's a little bit more successful than maybe stuff that's come before. I'm trying not to be divisive by just showing people that we are all just people. And like Momobo said, like, we're just trying to get through this life together. And why can't we just be kinder to one another? That's the whole thing. And then I really want to work on, once I conquer the teaching profession, I want to work on doing this with kids, or do it at the same time. I really want to get into those classrooms, starting in even early learning, going into creches, going into primary schools, and having these conversations about, we're all different, but we're all the same, and we're all just people, and just building that empathy from a really young age, I think is really important too. And hopefully if we can get that going, we can make some better people in this world without all the baggage that we have, without all the bad stuff. I want my kids to grow up in a place, I don't want them to have the baggage. If I can get it away from them as much as possible so that they can just be really good people and focus on being kind to one another, that's the goal. So I think we're all going towards the same thing there. So Sandrine, I'm sure you have something.
Yeah, no, I agree with everyone what they've said. With my approach, what I found that has really worked is intersectionality. I think for a really long time, I've kind of looked at my experiences in a very isolated way without really understanding the different forms or the different privileges I have as an educated person versus someone who isn't, and even like just with different migrant communities and stuff. So I think that's really helped talking to different people and understanding their different lived experiences. And I think even with Unapologetic or even the documentary, it's not making it about myself and kind of passing the mic on to that, because again, something that the way I've experienced racism is completely different from the way my sister had and the way my little brothers have. So it's just understanding those nuanced experiences, and when creating things like Unapologetic, like letting it be as open-minded and as open as possible. So that's one thing that has really worked. And yeah, just the other one is just constantly learning. So I there's a lot of topics that I'm still like learning about, or else I even have my own biases or my own set ways of it, and I'm constantly challenging myself through that, and it's difficult because I don't like to be wrong, but it helps. So I found that really moving forward, like when doing that, like just talking to different communities, talking to different people, and just understanding things. And another one is finding the nuanced in Black joy, because I think a lot of things I do, it's very depressing. Like, do you know, with my research, it's with post-colonial, there's no happy ending to it. So I think looking for things like with Black joy, and again, that moves from that sense of stereotype where even I just sometimes I'd be reading something and I feel very sorry for myself and I feel sorry for the place that I'm in. So it's really like moving beyond that. And again, that's through talking to people. And just the last part, it's I found that having a dual identity, I've had to apologize a lot for like taking up space like in academia or in the literary world or anything like that. So the one thing that has really worked is taking up those spaces, not like, yes, like definitely creating them, but just going into those avenues that are already created and really like proudly standing there and getting your own seat at the table. That has like really, really helped, because as I said, Unapologetic was the first thing that we did, like where I was like, okay, there's already like a large Irish literary scene, and just go take up that space and just be unapologetic about it. And I think with that, from the different people I've talked to, because even now I do workshops with young people in regards to like, oh, you actually can do literature and you can be a writer in Ireland, because they haven't seen like a Black writer or anything like that. And the one thing is like not being apologetic for like what you're writing about, and not being confined to like, oh, just write about racism or just write about sad things. Find a balance in that. And again, it just really just goes up to like just unapologetically taking up every space and not having to apologize for having that dual identity.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I think that's one of the like nicest, most beautiful things that come out of these even type of discussions. Because even all of these, I'm gonna do like some like Excel sheets for EDI groups in UCD and Anani about like response and stuff, because you know I'm trying to leave something good after I leave UCD. But I think the nicest thing is to also hear all of this complexity in people like us, because I think sometimes also it's very easy for kids maybe that look like us or people, they see activists or people doing things and they're like, oh no, it's just because they're super strong and they just like adore this and they're obsessed with this topic and you know they always want to do this. And it's like, no, it's like they have tons of other like mosaic of interests and things they want to do and things they do and they're good at, you know, and that they can still do, or they can drop this and do something new again, you know. And I think that's one of the nicest things to know about human beings. I'm being like very I'm gonna cry. But I think it's like so nice to see the humanity in everyone, you know, how it's just like we like different bits and bobs, and it's like, you know, the beauty in the world apart from all of this. So yeah, thank you guys so much. I love talking with you guys, and you guys are the best, and I hope I'll see you guys soon.
Thanks so much, Paula.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was nice chatting with you guys.